Okay, good morning everyone. Can everyone hear me? Great, okay, well good morning. Welcome to the session on can farming, salmon farming ever be sustainable? We're really excited to be here and to kick off Friday at the Oxford Rail Farming Conference. My name's Gina Lovett. I'm from Patagonia, the outdoor company. And this is a topic that has been really close to our hearts for a very, very long time. Our founder, Yvonne Chenard, started the company 50 years ago, and activism around river biodiversity has been in the DNA of the company ever since. And of course, when you think of river biodiversity, you think of wild salmon. And one of the drivers of the loss of wild salmon, and particularly wild Atlantic salmon, which are going extinct, is the rise of fish farms and the rise of salmon farms. So we've been campaigning on this. We've been supporting activists all over the world. In 2019, we had a film called Artificial, which was looking at some of these issues. Last year we were in Iceland supporting some NGOs and grassroots groups there. We helped defeated an aquaculture bill which would have been disastrous for the local communities and the wild salmon. And of course here in the UK we are funding a number of grassroots groups that are protecting wild fish, that are supporting local communities, that are fighting against salmon farms, but also that are trying to contribute to a different vision for coastal areas. So we're really excited to be able to bring this session to you this morning. How we're going to run, it's 90 minutes long. We're going to watch a film, a short documentary, 10 minutes, and we're really excited that this is the premiere of this short documentary. Not just yet, that's a preview. After that, we're very excited to have the film director and the filmmaker here with us, so we'll ask some questions, we'll invite the panel to the stage, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience here, and also online as well. So we haven't got a completely full room this morning because, you know, this is the early bird session, and I'm sure a lot of people were out last night and really getting into the swing of the conference. But I'd love to know a little bit more about who is in the room and kind of what your stake is in this discussion. So maybe just do a quick show of hands, and sorry to kind of lump you into very broad groups. But hands up, who is, you know, food grower, fish farmer on the practitioner side? Okay. That's great. And is anyone in the salmon industry? Okay, well, great. It would be really good to have your perspective. Okay, welcome. And sort of government agencies, institutions, anyone from that area? No one from DEFRA? Okay. Also online, I can't see kind of the chat right now, but if you're online, please feel free to share where you're from and what kind of sector or what kind of companies you're from as well. Is anyone in research or sort of the NGO side of things? Cool. Okay, that's good to know. So we have quite a few practitioners in the audience and quite a few researchers and NGOs as well. Okay, we're going to shift to watch the film Dying Logs. I'm really excited to introduce this. It's a 10-minute documentary which journeys into the Scottish Highlands, investigating not just the environmental impacts, but the social and the cultural impacts of salmon farming, which is extremely intensive in the northwest of Scotland, but looking at this through the voice of the communities and the voices of the lochs themselves. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes, and we'll introduce Francesco.
years ago, there was relatively little, certainly, awareness of the impact of the salmon industry. Now, it's still only a minority of people who would realise that there's an issue with salmon farming or eating farmed salmon or the environmental impacts of it. I do think that there is more understanding and more awareness in Scotland than there used to be, but it's still not enough.
People protect what they love. When the Westeros Marine Protected Area was set up, there were fish farms already within our waters, and the sort of concept behind it was that the sea belongs to us all. There needs to be space for us all to use the marine environment, and that can be children snorkeling, you know, right up through, you know, sustainable fishing, and it should be for everyone. That's really important. The fish farms were already there, so, OK, we will accept those, but they wouldn't expand. That was kind of the undertaking. And then they sold it to Maui, and Maui are 100% not honouring that. I mean, they are blatantly expanding, and they want to expand more. They're making no secret of that.
Maui in Scotland has grown up to around about 65,000 tonnes. Our growth has mainly been on new licenses in islands like Mock and Romp and Colonsay that are offshore but still provide a degree of shelter. And in all cases there, we've fully engaged with the community on those islands and brought them with us. You know, we've basically outlined what the economic benefit is to us and what we can do in terms of economic contribution to jobs in their society and infrastructure projects.
The industry across the board is trying to increase by 50% by 2030, and that is with the support of the Scottish Government. So I think what a lot of people want is just a moratorium on growth until they've addressed some of their issues, which are really well documented. I mean, they're increasing their chemical use. Nobody seems to be looking at the cumulative nutrient impact of all these fish farms. We know seagrass beds have gone extinct in the vicinity of fish farms here.
You know, the sea is absolutely at the beating heart of this community. And I think what's quite sad is that an awful lot of people don't understand the threat that the fish farms pose to that. You know, I just want to kind of shake people and go, no, this is really serious. You know, the drugs they're putting on those fish to kill the lice, that's going to take out the prawns, the crabs, the lobsters. You know, what's left of our fishing industry locally is really going to get decimated if they do what they are proposing.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a growing number of farms. There's more licenses are being applied for. I think there's around between 12 and 22 farms. It is a growing, and you often see license applications for a farm to have more pens or to extend the number of pens they have. Sort of in the 80s, local people had small holdings, I guess. They had maybe one pen. And then gradually over the years, you've seen the kind of multinational companies come in and buy the licenses.
There's four big players. There's Mowi, which is Norwegian-owned. There's Scottish Sea Farms, which is also Norwegian-owned. There's Bakkafrost, which used to be called Scottish Salmon Company, which is owned in the Faroes. And there's Cook Agriculture, which is owned in Canada. So all of the profits are exported, and there are a lot of profits, and all of the pollution Scotland gets. And whenever the main regulator, which is the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, tries to tighten things, they fight back, and they usually win, because they have a lot of political support in the government and because the Scottish Environment Protection Agency isn't as tough as it ought to be.
We think it should be difficult to gain licenses for salmon production, but it shouldn't be impossible. So we would call for the regulators to have more focus on food security and wealth creation from our natural and sustainable resources in Scotland.
There is a growing number of people that are questioning it as an industry and its role, and that idea of it's either the environment or jobs. I think more people maybe need to speak out about it, and they maybe behind closed doors they don't agree with it, but they don't maybe say it publicly. Yeah, there's a kind of entanglement in Skye between jobs, place, people, and it is a fragile community, you know.
But they've certainly got a lot dying. You can see some damage though, like nose, facial injuries, which probably would have come from lice at some stage. They might have been through the hydrolyser, you know, the hot water wash that they pump them in and they try and get the lice off that way.
The frequency of treatments in Scotland and Ireland has to be a little bit higher because it's warmer during the summer. So when we use a wellboat, and that's a large vessel, often in the region of between 60 and 100 metres in length, but we can't get away from the fact that because of warming of coastal temperatures in Scotland, it has been challenging to farm fish in the sea. Because of rising temperatures, we've seen a lot more plankton and micro jellyfish in Scottish waters than we would normally have had.
The mortality rate, the number of salmon that die in fish farms, is startlingly high. I mean, it varies from year to year, but it can get up to kind of 30, 40 or even 50% of the stock in bad years when there's diseases or bad weather conditions or a combination of things that make the salmon sick. And it's obviously something that the industry doesn't like because it means they're losing money and they're not able to harvest as many fish. But it's a major problem, and it seems to have been getting worse in recent years.
Salmon farming has encountered many difficulties over the past years, resulting in mass mortality rates and in a drop in reputation for the salmon farming industry. If you look here at the back, you see the island, and you see to the left of the island, this would be filled with cages. But it's not only about us. This is about the west coast of Scotland and the possibility as well of having solutions to the current problems of salmon farms which are viable and which won't desecrate the whole of the west coast.
This is the proposed site of this new fish farm. One of the disadvantages of the proposed system is you need a lot more infrastructure on land. So they will build on all this area here, which is, yes, would be a big loss to the area. There were lots of sea urchins. It's a big kelp forest, so the kelp supports many other species that grow off the kelp, live among the kelp. So there are different sorts of starfish that live off the bivalves that live in there. So I saw some very nice horse mussels.
But it's hard to show people what there is under the surface of the sea. It's hard to make them kind of see the threat, see the danger.
We're small communities and everybody is aware of being in a small community. We don't want to divide these communities. You know, we rely on one another. The winters are tough.
So that's what I'm doing. I go out to farms all over Scotland, get the footage, put it online. It's just about people knowing what they're paying for, because these factory farms wouldn't be here if people aren't paying for the salmon flesh that they're wanting to buy.
The premiere of Dying Locks, very short but precise introduction to some of the issues in Scotland around salmon farming. Really pleased to introduce Francesco De Agostini, the filmmaker here from Italy. Take a seat.
Thank you.
Let's have a little chat. So, Francesco, just first of all, tell us about yourself and how did you get into this line of work?
Yes, basically I'm a journalist. I work as a video journalist. I'm specializing in food matters and food and environmental matters. So I've been working for the last 10, 12 years about this stuff. But most of the things that we are discussing in these days in this conference about the problem of pesticides, of agriculture, industrial agriculture, food security, environment. And in the last few years I've been working a little bit more on farming, factory farms on land a few years ago, and now this led me to talk about fish farming.
Yeah, you inevitably end up there. So your last documentary was called Until the End of the World. That was out in 23-24. And I don't know if anybody here has seen that. It's well worth a watch, and we'll put the link in the chat as well. But this was looking at fish farming more broadly and across regions, across species, and this premise of fish farming promising to feed the world. But you found so many contradictions in this claim.
Yes, in fact, we heard the claim also in this documentary. No, the CEO from Maui, Scotland, was saying that we have to focus more on food security. And the other documentary was a longer documentary. Is 1 hour length. Is a feature documentary. So was exploring in a global way and in a very deep way this claim, because it's the claim which the other documentary talks about a lot about the FAO and the UN position suggesting that fish farming is a sustainable way to feed the global population, the growing global population. Everybody agrees that we need to change our food system because it's not sustainable anymore. And so someone globally agreed that we have to reduce our meat consumption, dairy consumption, because it's really too much, and the livestock production evidently is giving huge problems. And there is a lot of people that say, including FAO, that say that we have to invest more in fish farming because fish is better than a calf or a cow in terms of climate emissions. And so there is this green money being poured into the growth of fish farming all over the world. So my trip and my journey in the aquaculture industry was driven by this claim that fish farming is sustainable. That is something that applies also here, because even if FAO don't really think of salmon when they think that aquaculture is sustainable, you can hear also the guy from Maui saying that we have to make things sustainably. No? He used this term. And I spoil you. The previous documentary at the end found out that no, this cannot be a sustainable solution. It's an industry. It's an industry which has a different impact from other livestock production, but it is not sustainable at all. That documentary was more focusing on species of fish farmed in the Mediterranean region. So the main object was sea bream and sea bass in Italy, Greece, Turkey, Spain. And the first thing that came out was a local impact, very, very similar to what we saw it, maybe even worse because there are so many cages in close bays, archipelagos, in close waters, so there was an evident local impact. And the second part of the documentary was going more on the main paradox of this claim that fish farming is going to feed the world, which is the use of fish feed, of course, no? Because for sea bream, sea bass, of course salmon, and the main commercial species are carnivorous, shrimps. Now we are talking about octopus farming. All of them rely on feed. And the amount of wild fish that you use to nourish this fish in the farms is more than the actual production. No? Now you will talk more about this maybe later during the panel, but always, when we talk about carnivorous fish like this species, also tuna, for example, the ratio is very, very incredible, like 10 kilos of wild fish for just 1 kilo of tuna, when they make the feedlot to make the bigger. And so in the documentary, I reached places where they are taking this wild fish, notably West Africa, where they are really bringing people to the hunger to take the fish to make the feed to feed our salmon. So I don't really see how, because when you talk about the industry, they say that they are reducing the amount of fish feed that they use to farm the fish. But I think that even if we reach the 1-to-1 ratio, you still are taking fish where it's poor fish, where it is more needed, and you are bringing to the other part of the world to produce a high-end production for us.
And of course, with all of the associated impacts and pollution around that. Yeah, I mean, I think whatever way you look, there are so many impacts and so many issues, and yeah, the feed is definitely one. So thank you for flagging that. I just want to come back. So with this film, you're focusing in on salmon and Scotland. Why salmon and Scotland, and what do you want to achieve with the film?
Yeah, I mean, the past 4 years, I've met really lots of communities in different parts of the world, and all of them were fighting against this increase, this growth, very fast growth of the fish farming industry, of the fish farming industry, which is actually the fastest growing food industry in the world. And this led me, I found different levels of awareness. Even in Norway, which is the first country, the biggest country producing salmon, there is now a certain level of awareness. And it was raised mostly in the last few years because they were dealing with huge rates of mortality. They had kind of 17% of the production, they were dying in the farms. So there was a public outcry because they were saying, oh my God, 1/5 of our production is dying in the farms. So there was a national debate, even in Norway, where it's really difficult to talk in this way about salmon farming. And then I found out that in Scotland the figures were even worse. Probably you will talk more about this later. But so I came to Scotland to see what was going on, and I just spent some days here visiting the places to try to understand what was the understanding and the awareness among the people respect of the problems related to this industry, the local problems, environmental, ethical problems, because when you're wasting like 30% of the fish is dying without being used, it's really something also ethical, I think. Yeah, what I found is I was expecting to find more awareness, because in every place that I visited there were groups, organized groups, fighting against the growth of the industry in different ways, but I also found that most of them, if not all of them, were kind of not willing to speak loudly about this, because there are someone in the community, the woman at the end said that there are many people in the community some people in the community which are working in the industry. They don't want to divide the communities, but this is something that is problematic, I think, because even in Greece, where some few years ago they didn't have a lot of awareness about the problems from fish farming. Now they have a national network of communities working together to face the institution, to face the industry, and to find out ways to avoid the depletion of the natural resources. Yeah. While in Scotland I found just isolated groups which are not very, I think, good to work together, be a network, and publicly say this is a problem because this is basically destroying our natural resources, our environment, and it's making a different thing of our communities now. Yeah. And yes, this is what I found.
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting angle, particularly when some of the industry bodies are, labeling community activists as extremists, when they're simply documenting and trying to tell the truth and trying to point out what's going on. I think whatever we can do to help galvanize people and bring them together is great. Thank you for the moment, Francesco. We're going to come back. Maybe if you just move to the end there.
Okay.
We stay for the Q&A. And I would like to invite our panel up to the stage now. First up, we have Rachel Mulrenan, who's the Scotland Director of Wildfish. And Wildfish is an NGO which is unsurprisingly dedicated to the protection of wild fish and their habitats. And Rachel is the driver behind the campaign Off the Table, which is now a franchise that's happening all around the world, from Canada to Tasmania, all started from the UK, and that's calling on chefs, restaurants and consumers to take salmon off the menu, farm salmon off the menu. We're really excited to have Caroline Bennett here. Caroline is a well-known name, a restaurateur, founder of Moshi Moshi, which was London's first sushi restaurant many, many years ago. Caroline has always been trying to do things differently and ethically and to do the right thing. She's also the founder of Soul of Discretion, which is a community interest company, and it's focused on sourcing and selling seafood directly from low-impact, small-scale fishers, so dealing with wild fisheries. Steady there. Caroline is excited to be here.
Clearly.
And online, I should have said at the beginning as well that we have a slight change to the lineup, because Corin Smith and Francois Beyers from Carrymore, which is the regenerative sea farming company in Wales, neither were able to make it due to unforeseen circumstances. But we have Ailsa McClellan with us, who was in the film, and Ailsa is more than qualified to talk on this topic. Ailsa is a marine specialist. She's a native oyster farmer. She's working with Sea Wilding, which is a Patagonia grantee, and it's a community-led initiative which is dedicated to restoring the Scottish seabed through seagrass and native oyster farming. And Ailsa has worked with fishing organisations. She's done auditing. She's worked for the marine policy making bodies, and she's absolutely passionate about protecting the inshore zone and the people that depend on it. So big hand and thank you to Ailsa for joining and stepping in at the last moment. Thank you, Ailsa. Okay, so just while the film is fresh in our minds, maybe just a quick round of reactions to what landed with you or what resonated most. And Ailsa, let's go to you first.
I mean, I think seeing myself in these things is uncomfortable because it's been going on for so long. I just feel frustrated watching this film because we've been saying the same thing now since I graduated, and not a lot has changed, and in fact the industry has expanded. So it's frustration, and like Francois says, we are not maybe cohesive enough within the communities in objecting. But I think partially that's because the industry use language in a very deliberate way to make out that the people that are objecting aren't actually part of the communities.
Yeah.
So maybe that's something we should all be working harder at in Scotland when we're objecting to this.
Okay, thanks, Ailsa. Rachel?
Yes, I also agree with Francesca's points about like the sustainability question and the food security questions that were raised during the film, or the claims that were raised. I think also just the mortalities, the huge issue of mortalities in the industry, I think for me that's like a really powerful symbol of the wider environmental issues that we have in Scotland and globally with the industry. So yeah, I think that's...
Absolutely, and the comparison there with what would be tolerated or not tolerated on land. Thank you. And Caroline?
I think that the notion that, I mean, the coastal communities are fragile, I think Shona brought that up really clearly, and it's the same for the fishing communities down in the southwest. So the fragility of a community, and also the notion that somebody else was saying in the film, nobody wants to stick their neck out, because if you're in the industry as a small-scale fisher, you stick your neck out and the next day you know your pots are gone, or your fixed net's been towed away, or your dive kit's disappeared. There's active aggression from the bigger fishing vessels to do that. And then the other thing was the feed, which of course is just such a massive element of, unsolvable. And now you see in the southwest many Ghanaians on the fishing vessels of the beam trawlers, because their own, and they're excellent fishers. Who doesn't want to employ a Ghanaian fisherman in Cornwall? They're brilliant, but they've been displaced because their own fishing grounds are so depleted that they've had to look for economic work elsewhere. And then that fuels this whole, we don't want foreigners rubbish.
Yeah, good point there. So before, we are going to come back to kind of talking about the fragility of communities, but the hold that companies have on communities. But I just want to pick up on, let's set the scene a little bit more in terms of the environmental impacts. And Rachel, let's go to you first. Can you sketch out the impacts for us a little bit more?
I can try. I'll try and do it succinctly, but I suppose, we often divide the impacts of salmon farming into kind of three categories. So you've got the environmental impacts, you've got the welfare issues and impacts, and the sustainability issues, and they're obviously all interlinked. But I think fundamentally a lot of the environmental issues come from the very nature of how salmon is farmed, but also all the inputs that are required into open net salmon farming. And I think as an industry, it has such a huge ecological impact that's seen not just in the places where it's being farmed, but also globally through the use of wild-caught fish and the ecosystem impact that has for feed, but also for use of wrasse as cleaner fish, for instance, which are taken from other ecosystems. At Wild Fish, we obviously have historically focused predominantly on the impact on wild fish populations, and obviously sea lice parasites would be the number one concern that we have in terms of impacts from open net salmon farms, because sea lice parasites, they do occur naturally in the wild, but they proliferate on salmon farms because of the densities of fish that you have in these farms, but they present both welfare issues for the fish, but also can transfer to wild migrating salmon and sea trout. And as you said, we are in a position where populations of wild Atlantic salmon in the UK are now endangered, and that impact is really, it's one of the recognised dangers by the Scottish Government, basically, for wild fish populations. But a lot of the wider environmental impacts also stem from trying to treat the sea lice, because you need to use chemicals in order to treat sea lice and disease proliferation as well. And then the impact that these chemicals are having on the immediate environment. I mean, Janice covered it in the film. You've got chemicals being used that are known to be toxic to other crustaceans. So the impact that that's having is huge as well. Yeah. And I'll hand over to Elsa because she's got so much knowledge about.
Because Elsa, you mentioned like cumulative nutrient impacts, and that isn't really being well researched at the moment. Tell us a little bit more about that.
I mean, there are thousands of tons of uneaten food, excrement coming from these fish farms every day. And I mean, if you imagine a terrestrial farm suspended over the sea and all that falling into the water, nobody would put up with it, or you can't see it. So we know that this nutrient enrichment impacts seabed habitats, including really sensitive ones like merle and seagrass, which are carbon sinks. And in Scotland, marine mud is our biggest carbon sink. More than all of Scotland's forestry peat, terrestrial soils, our marine mud sinks most carbon, and that only works as a carbon sink if it's living mud with a lot of creatures in it, bioturbating. And there's been a lot of research in other countries like Chile about how aquaculture basically kills that function in the mud. So our government in Scotland are putting money towards habitat restoration, but there just seems to be no point in it. There's no point planting seagrass if you're not addressing the main drivers of decline. And nutrient enrichment is one of the main ones. I'm also work with the fishermen a lot, and like Rachel was saying, all of Scotland's fishermen on the inshore now rely on shellfish because of mismanaged fisheries, basically. And sea lice are the same family as shellfish, all these chemicals going directly into the water, and it includes organophosphates. I mean, stuff that terrestrial farmers aren't allowed to use in sheep dip anymore are still used on fish farms. So the creel fishermen have a really legitimate concern about the impact to their livelihoods from this increasing chemical use. And I'll stop in a minute. 5 years ago, we did a government inquiry into aquaculture. One of the things the industry said they would do would be to reduce these main chemical use, and they have all gone up. So they're not managing to keep a lid on it at all.
Yeah. There's so many interactions there because, of course, the warming waters and climate change exacerbates the parasites and the sea lice, which means more treatments, which impacts the seabed function and the carbon function, which worsens climate change. And I think what you say, Elsa, about, the kind of, I think there's a lack of understanding about the carbon functionality, and that you need diversity of life to be making that carbon cycle work. And of course that impacts other sectors, in the shellfish farmers and the small-scale fishers. So there's a whole range of impacts that are interconnected. But Rachel, I just want to come back to the point about mortalities, because this is something that really plagues the industry all over the world. And the latest figures from the Fish Health Inspectorate, so they show that 13.5 million salmon mortalities were reported by Scottish farms from January to October in 23. There was a doubling of mortalities in 2022. And we heard in the film, mortality rates can go up to 50%. So for me, it seems like this is just on so many levels. This way of farming in open pens is not viable. I mean, animal welfare crisis, but even economically, the amount of input needed. Some people are calling, and if you read industry magazines like Intrafish, the commentators are saying, actually, we need more stringent rules on things like mortalities. What would it look like if there were more stringent rules? Would it make a difference? Would it impact the business? Would it get the change that we need?
I suppose if there was more stringent legislation, regulation, I think you could solve certain issues related to salmon farming, but I don't think any regulation could fully make this a sustainable food system, because it's fundamentally unsustainable, and there are so many sustainability issues with the feed, and then you've also got the welfare issues and the environmental issues. I don't think legislation could cover that. I think we have seen, so just 2 days ago, Washington State in the US became the first country or the first place in the world to vote to permanently ban open net fish farming from their waters. And actually something that the Department of Natural Resources said during that hearing really resonated with me, which is the best mitigation for avoiding environmental damage from salmon farming is avoidance. And that's what it is. But unfortunately, we don't have that in Scotland. In Scotland, we have very piecemeal legislation, regulation, which cover various aspects of the impacts from the industry, but they don't cover, they work in silos, so there's lots of gaps. And as you say, there's no upper limit on mortality, so farms can experience, and we had recently this year, a company that had experienced 80% mortalities on its farms in the Isle of Gigha has just had planning permission for a new farm in the same area, and there's been no consideration as to the past performance of those farms. But yeah, unfortunately, we are in a position in Scotland still where actually the government, I think, does acknowledge now that there is negative environmental impacts and others from the industry, but they still have this line that the mitigation works in terms of limiting that damage, and it's just not true because the mitigation in itself is insufficient. It's also not properly enforced or kind of reported on, because obviously there's a question of resourcing as well, and the government is massively out-resourced by the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Caroline or Elsa, do you want to add anything to that?
Maybe just that our government ministers, who should be more neutral, are incredibly supportive of this industry, and in Scotland they want to double production of aquaculture by 2030, I think. So you've got ministers promoting Scottish farm salmon all around the globe, and the same ministers won't show up at a Sea Scotland conference, for example, which is the environmental bodies. And we need a lot more balance here, and I'm sure this will be talked about by Rachel maybe down the line. It would be good to have a cost-benefit analysis on farming and how that's weighed against the money they get. They get millions of pounds every year from Scottish Government and against the impacts to fishermen and other sectors. It'd be nice to see more balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when we first visited Loch Duart back in the early 2000s, and they were run by two local people, I think they genuinely had an interest in creating quality salmon. I think there was a sense that they were going to do it differently. And then slowly but surely, they develop, they emerge, they get bigger. And then the last time I went to visit was 2019, and they just got this grant from EU taxpayers, there's £1 million, to get these 250,000 each pound debris removers. So there were these massive machines going up and down the sides of the net to remove debris. And I remember one of the reasons that we really liked Loch Duart back in the day was that 1 year in every 3 they'd raise the nets to allow a fallow period for everything to kind of get back to normal. And of course the pressure from the outside investors was such that they didn't want to afford that luxury of a fallow year. So they invested in these massive machines, and I remember Andy just being really shocked by the noise. The noise was just deafening for us on land. Goodness only knows what it was doing for the poor salmon, and then all the other creatures around it, and all the creatures trying to navigate their way on sonar. So yeah, the balance just isn't right. And then it's just the notion that that £1 million, had it gone of taxpayers' money, had it gone to local communities around the coast, what an impact that would have made. And for sure, it's hard for government to pool all these small-scale communities together. And that is, maybe one of the largest single factors that's coming across in not just this thing, but all the other seminars I've been in. The voice of the small-scale farmer, fisher, whatever it is just so hard for policymakers to garner. And I think that's, you've got the Soil Association, at least policymakers can talk to them. In the fishing world, you've just got nothing of that nature. So it just makes policy and regulation and all the rest of it that much harder.
Yeah, when you have all these disparate voices dispersed over the regions. I think it's really interesting what you're touching on here, because it kind of points to, you know, the hold that companies have within communities, but, you know, also if the investments that government is currently putting into the salmon industry, which, you know, is kind of a drop in the ocean compared to agriculture, but it would mean so much more for local communities. But how do we begin to rebalance this power, you know, and this hold that companies have over communities and governments? Ailsa, maybe should we go to you first?
I wish I knew. I mean, they have got a stranglehold at the moment, really. And it's down to, I mean, the only way I can see them giving up that hold is if they're not allowed to farm here anymore. Because at the moment they're doing it, the water's getting warmer, it's getting harder and harder, but scarcity puts the price up. So, you know, even though they're getting horrific mortalities that Rachel mentioned, they can still make money doing it. We need more regulation. Well, I think we should have a moratorium on growth and not have any more salmon farmers until they've sorted out their issues, which would be a good start.
And actually that moratorium on growth was a recommendation of a 2018 inquiry at the Scottish Parliament into salmon farming, and that is a quite widely supported stance, because it seems insane that the industry is, you know, being permitted to expand when it has such existential issues that it's facing, and it's got this huge range of welfare issues, environmental issues that it hasn't addressed. So to just expand that blindly, it just is mad. I think something that we definitely see as a gap at Wildfish is any holistic overview, as Ailsa mentioned, of what the net benefit of the salmon farming industry is to Scotland, but also but taking that, so at the moment all the figures that are used is just kind of the gross benefit, and they're quite kind of top line figures, but the government's never looked at what are the negative impacts of that sector, both on other sectors, so as we mentioned, you know, creel fishing and other sectors, but also wider environmental impacts. So that's like a huge data gap that the Scottish Government doesn't have, and that's something that we as an organisation are really pushing for them to commission, because they should have that. If they want to support this industry, they should really have solid data to show and solid evidence to show why they're supporting it. And also just, I know we haven't really touched on the jobs yet, maybe we'll talk about it a bit more, but in terms of a lot of support is based on jobs creation in Scotland, and obviously the industry does, oh, you've got these.
You can pull those figures up.
Yeah, they're really useful.
The industry does provide some employment, but if you look at the growth, since 1990, there's only been 253 new jobs created on salmon farms in Scotland. So that's an average of 7 new jobs per year. So between 1990 and 2023, when the latest data is available, 253 jobs. And that's being generous because that's looking at the creation of full-time jobs. So actually, if you look at full-time and part-time jobs combined on the farms, there's no difference, there's no increase in jobs. So actually, if you look at the huge amount of damage that this industry has caused over that same time period, you have to think, is it worth it for 253 new jobs?
Yeah. And just to add to that, there's that employment comparison. You know, so some of the other sectors, you know, jobs in wild salmon fishing, this from 2019, but this was shared in the Scottish Parliament, you know, around 4,000. In wild fisheries, around 4,000. You know, there's a total number of jobs in the Highlands, 122,000. So I think getting those job figures in perspective is really important, as you say.
But also the challenge, I think, and the challenge that we have in Scotland is looking at the historical sectors as well. So who's being employed historically? Because 4,300 people working in wild salmon fishing in rivers and coasts on itself doesn't maybe sound like the biggest figure. I mean, it's bigger than the number of people directly employed on salmon farms, but anecdotally, like, I have countless testimonies from people from over the years who've lost employment through, you know, no longer having viable recreational fisheries, which is being impacted by the growth of this industry. So I think, it's kind of a challenge for us, I think, to look at, like, historically, what has been in Scotland, what we have now, but also looking to the future. And I'm not saying you would want to wholesale, you can't go backwards to what once was, but it's also having this vision for actually what could there be. And Scotland has so many natural, as Ben Hanfield says, natural and sustainable resources at its disposal, and there must be a better way for us to use that in the future than the way that's currently being used.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about this cost-benefit analysis piece, that, and because you and some other organisations have sent an open letter to the Scottish government.
Yes, yeah. So we sent an open letter in November that was signed by more than 50 Scottish businesses, charities, community groups, conservation groups, and yeah, it was basically just calling for the government to evidence the support that it has for the industry and to actually do that kind of national level research. And that was, so we sent the open letter and it was raised in the Scottish Parliament. It was claimed in the Scottish Parliament by the Cabinet Secretary that this is something that's being done at a local authority level. So she claimed that at the planning stage for new farms, local councils are apparently conducting their own cost-benefit analyses, which isn't true. Like we followed up with local authorities, it's not being done. I mean, it should be being done nationally anyway, but it's not being done locally either. So we see just such a huge gap in knowledge, yeah.
Yeah. When do you expect that out?
So at the moment, we're just calling for the Scottish Government to carry it out. I mean, I suppose if they're not willing to do it, it's maybe something we would consider doing, but yeah, I don't know what the time frame would be for that.
Okay, so sometime throughout 2025. Yeah. I know it's a big piece of work. I also, maybe just picking up with you, because you're in the community in Ullapool and you're working with and you're meeting with small-scale fishers, and is there anything else to say, sort of on the impact of their livelihoods and what they've experienced?
Well, I mean, basically just what we've talked about with anti-sea lice medication and this general seabed degradation from the destruction of habitat. So it's such a complicated system, it's hard to know what part agriculture has played in the degradation of habitat, but it's definitely linked, and the fishermen are all concerned, quite rightly. The Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation are looking to do a study with the Scottish Association of Marine Science this year, looking at how the chemicals are persisting in the sediment, because these things have got quite a long half-life, and when they degrade, it's not like they turn into something neutral and better. I think when azomethicose breakdown, it actually makes into something equally toxic. And none of this stuff's really been looked at enough. So the fishermen just want it to basically clean up a bit so that it's not impacting the only stocks that they've got left, which are the shellfish.
Yeah, the wild fisheries are already in quite dire straits.
And sorry, I think just one other thing is, we do have quite a lot of shellfish, aquaculture, oysters, mussels where we are, and microplastics are an increasing problem because the public are more aware of them. And obviously these bivalves are filter feeders, and a lot of these microplastics are pumped out by feed barges. So as salmon farms increasingly automate, they have moved away from hand feeding, so hardly any of them do hand feed anymore, to these feed barges, which are huge structures that pump pellets at high velocities down tubes, and that's abrading plastic all the time. So these things are a very real concern as well for the fish farmers that are doing shellfish, which I think is a sustainable protein and a really good way of using our marine space in Scotland, and also people like us that are restoring, because these microplastics do have an impact on the health of various creatures as well, including us, if they get up the food chain to the human.
Yeah, I think there was that research a few years ago that said we all ingest a credit card of plastic a week via the food we eat.
A week.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the regulatory side, so I mean, it's really hard for government, but I think ownership is increasing in every aspect a big issue. And when Loch Duat, as I said, it was owned by two relatively local people, and I think now the biggest shareholder is the founder of eBay, their vested interest in the community and the environment that it supports, of course, is completely absent compared to somebody that lived and worked in the community. And the same could be said of the wild fisheries, where the fishers that we work with, who are small-scale, low-impact fishers who perhaps come from generations of fishing communities, they have a sense. I'm not saying they're all angels by any stretch of the imagination, but at least they have this vision that they are continuing something that their forefathers have done for generations, and that therefore to leave something left in the sea is to the benefit of the commons, to everybody. Whereas the poor Ghanaians, who are inadvertently, unwillingly in many cases, brought in for this, I'll be contentious and say modern-day slavery employment, but that's essentially what it might be. They are remunerated by the volume of fish that they take out of the sea. So, of course, you've automatically there turned the emphasis as to how you make your money and how you preserve the oceans. So I think ownership really is something that somehow government has to get to grips with. And then the second thing is, it sounds like tiny amounts of money, but £1 million. And then we were talking about the Ardesi site that Elsa was talking about before we came on, a new hatchery that Mowi are building. And they apparently got £20 million of Scottish taxpayers' money to build this new hatchery. £20 million spread out along the coast for building infrastructure for small-scale fishers to land, or icing plants for them to keep their quality up, or discussions about logistics for small-scale businesses to compete and survive. All this could be used, and it's going to the easiest, I will create 7 jobs a year industry, because they're the only ones that are saying, hello, we need some money.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think with the foreign ownership, the wealth going overseas, the kind of limited additional impact of jobs or additional benefit of jobs, it really is unclear how much of this economic benefit really holds up. It's such an important argument, the social side of it, and I don't think it's brought up enough. I want to turn now to certification. So also a big topic, and we're definitely not going to get through it in a few minutes, but to scratch the surface a little bit, because it's such a big part of the credibility of salmon. And the issues that we've been talking about, the welfare, the environmental issues, they persist across all of the kind of labels, whether it's welfare assured, whether it's organic, whether it's sustainable, whatever label it has. And instead, these benefits, the reputation goes to the retailers, the reputation goes to the salmon industry, and the financial benefits as well. Rachel, can you tell us a little bit more about this topic of certification? Because you've, with Wildfish, have been comparing the different labels over the last few years.
Sure, yeah. So we've done some research at Wildfish on the main certification labels that are being used within the Scottish salmon farming industry. So that's Aquaculture Stewardship Council, ASC. You've got RSPCA Assured certification and Soil Association's Organic Standard as well. And we concluded from our research that there are 2 fundamental issues with certification. One is that the standards are not set high enough, they're not ambitious enough. The requirements often don't go substantially beyond national regulation, and also we have seen historically where standards have been super ambitious, they've then been watered down by industry interests within the technical advisory groups on the certification schemes. Secondly, the issue of enforcement is a real problem, because actually, even if you have these standards, and I think the RSPCA Assured standard has something like 450 requirements now, it's like super expansive, but actually enforcing those requirements is practically impossible. I think auditors rely, and I think this is an issue actually across all certification schemes, across different sectors, different industries, but particularly with salmon, because the farms themselves are in such remote locations, it's such a technical issue that the bodies that are certifying rely so heavily on industry input that they can't work out whether what they're being told is, you know, the whole truth or whether it's a partial truth, or whether, you know, there's vested interests involved. But I think these two things fundamentally mean that certification schemes, consumers believe that certification represents something that it's not representing. And that is a huge, huge issue, because you see that it's always the first thing that people will ask about is, oh, but, you know, if I'm buying, and by people I mean just general conversations I have with friends and family all the time, you know, if I'm buying an organic certified salmon, is that okay? Or if I'm buying, you know, RSPCA assured salmon, surely that's okay. And it's not. And I think with RSPCA assured certification, there's been a lot of scrutiny actually on that certification over the last year, but it does not have an upper limit on mortality allowed on the farms. So actually you can, and you do see farms that have had upwards of 80% mortality, so 80% of the fish dying on a farm. The remaining 20% are then sold as responsibly produced or higher welfare fish. So it's fundamentally completely flawed, and it is what we see it as a real barrier in our work, both in terms of educating consumers, but also pushing for, I mean, we don't do this at Wildfish, but pushing for, say, animal welfare, like stronger legislation around welfare for farmed fish. The Scottish Government will use RSPCA assured certification as a proxy. So they'll say, oh, but, you know, we have the highest welfare standards in the world because all of our farms are RSPCA assured welfare certified. So it is a really big issue.
It's a big smokescreen. Elsa, I think you have an interesting perspective on this as well, because you have been involved in auditing.
Yeah, so after I graduated, I should come clean, I did work for the industry, but the more I saw, the less I liked it. And it's funny because we talked about salt water a lot here, but in the hatchery stage, that is where the waste begins, and I think that's where I mainly worked. You know, they cull out thousands of fish every year because they're the small grade. So I was just kind of horrified by the waste and the chemical use, and I went to audit for the RSPCA because I thought that was a way of making the industry pull its socks up. But it quickly became apparent that you had to be good at passing an audit to remain in the scheme, but not necessarily, they weren't experiencing any less welfare issues than other farms. I mean, as long as I've been on farms where thousands of fish would be dying from gill disease, sea lice, whatever. As long as that farm has done the correct paperwork, informed the right people, Fish Health Inspector at RSPCA, then they're fine, they're good to go. So I don't think that that works as a way of raising welfare in farms. And of course, it's only about the fish in the farm. They're not concerned about the environment or the wrasse that they're catching to put in the farms. And the other thing is, the whole standard was made with fish farmers. You know, they're not including the wild fish interests or animal welfare specialists. So the farmers have developed this standard themselves, and they're still not managing to keep a lid on mortalities and welfare issues.
Absolutely.
You also do see, just one addition, you definitely see examples where the certification schemes are reduced in terms of ambition, and I think I mentioned this at the start. But one good example is ASC certification, because, and again, this links in with the role that retailers, like big retailers, play, I think, in certification bodies, because Sainsbury's a few years ago made an announcement that it would only source ASC certified salmon, which on the surface seems like a positive move, but I think actually what that means is that then there's a huge demand for ASC certified salmon, and then we saw very concretely how the bar was then lowered to enable more farms to be certified to fulfill that demand. And a couple of years ago, ASC basically dramatically watered down its sea lice limits for its certification. So whereas initially the requirements had been based on best international practice, which I think was modelled on Norway, which in itself is not without issues, but it was modelled on the Norwegian limits. But actually they changed that so that now each country just has to adhere to its own national legislation or regulation around it, which in Scotland is magnitudes higher, something like 5 to 20 times higher in terms of like the sea lice levels that are now permitted on ASC certified farms. But there's been no change in the public face of ASC certification. So as a consumer, you do not know that. And even as someone who works for an NGO, these standards are like 300 pages long. Like, they're incredibly technical and complex, and riddled with loopholes as well.
It's a perfect storm for moving the goalposts.
But not advertising that you've moved them as well. That's the thing. There's no public communication that actually what you're buying as a consumer. If you bought ASC certified salmon 2 years ago, what you were buying then is different to what you're buying now, and there's no knowledge of that. So,
I mean, what comes to mind for me is like, how can I get accurate information about what I'm buying as a consumer? Does that exist? Is it possible?
Well, yeah. So for me, looking at the comparison of fin farm aquaculture and, say, wild fish, maybe wild-caught fish on a scale of 1 to 10, you've got 1, maybe dynamite fishing. That might be considered the worst form of fishing on the planet from an environmental perspective. And then maybe on 10, at the best, you've got maybe dive-caught scallops or handline mackerel, that kind of thing. And then you've got this whole grey area in the middle of between 1 and 10 with trawlers, fixed nets, pots, blah, 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 blah. And we could all argue the toss on each of those. But, you can go from really very damaging dynamite to much, much better dive-caught scallop. There's a massive environmental and social difference. And yet in the fish farms, Moe might be, well, I'm not going to say Moe, somebody might be number 1, but the best one might only be 2. It might just scrape 3, but it's never going to get up to 8, 9, or 10. So irrespective of the certifications, they're only going to be taking you a little bit further up the better chain, is my thoughts on
There's no
that.
differentiation in the practice.
Not
really.
enough, not enough to warrant the labelling that's out there. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we've got a real gap between what we're buying, what we think we're buying as consumers, and what is really happening behind the scenes. But consumption is growing, and if you think about salmon consumption maybe in the 80s or 90s and what it is today, and sushi, sorry Caroline, on every corner, and poke bowls galore. But we heard in the film that the farms wouldn't be proliferating if consumer demand wasn't so high. And I think it comes back to, salmon is kind of convenient. There's so many vested interests in it. It's one of the few dominant species. How do we begin to reduce our reliance on a fish like salmon?
Well, in many ways, I think, people look at in salmon farming, it's the industry, but in wild fisheries, it's the fisheries as being the cause of the problem. But I actually think it's much more to do with restaurants or the retailers who, irrespective of weather, irrespective of season, they want the same thing on the menu available, 365 days a year. Yeah. And for a fish processor, there is nothing better than having the same size salmon appear on your machinery to fillet and cut at vast volumes. It'll arrive at 9, it'll be done by 5. It's so easy to manage. Whereas you get wild fish, you'll get one little fish this big and another one that big, and one will be that fat and the other will be that thin. It's so much harder to process. And therefore you can't scale it, and you can't make those tiny little margins that on scale make you a billionaire. Nature's the problem, Gina. But we've got to get... I keep falling off this chair. Why is nobody else falling off it? You've got to get your heads around that we can't square industry to fit nature. We've got to work the other way around. I just think it's that creation of... I mean, there are models that make it work, aren't there? You go to St. John's restaurant and they'll just cross it out when it's the fish of the day is gone. But ironically, sushi, when I was eating it in the 80s, salmon didn't appear. It wasn't on the menu, but it wasn't there because of the anisakis parasite. And it was only with the advent of farmed salmon that it became possible. So when I first started 30 years ago, We didn't have much salmon on our menu, actually, but then it became the cheapest fish. It was extraordinary. It just became cheaper than anything else, and people wanted it, and we just carried on supplying it, and blah, 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 blah. But yeah, I think the key is always to differentiate. But I mean, just as the salmon farming industry is unsustainable, I'm afraid I think sushi is also unsustainable on a global level. It's, you know, you just can't do it.
It's all about scale.
Yeah. And even before you get to the fish, you've got avocados and cucumbers 24, days, 365 days a year. You can't start.
Yeah. Elsa, any thoughts on how we reduce our reliance? Because, and I'm particularly thinking of you because, your work in native oyster farming, your work with sea wilding, you're really trying to create a different vision for, coastal health and coastal communities.
I mean, so everyone should know that I'm a complete ranter when it comes to fishing and seabed abuse that way too. But it's all part of the same mismanagement of Scotland's inshore seabed. And if we could sort that out, then we could maybe get our finfish stocks back and have more diverse fisheries that way. But I'm also really interested in the concept of eating the bait fish instead of the salmon. So there's this horrible label for fish like sprat, anchovy, herring, mackerel even, like these fish that really, Ullapool where I live was built on herring. So these fish have been relabeled forage fish or bait fish as if they're not fit for human consumption, when in fact we'd all be better eating them than the salmon. Cambridge University did a study last year looking at the nutrients in the bait fish as opposed to the farmed salmon. And there's a net loss of all these nutrients, like calcium, iodine, iron, omega, vitamin B12, vitamin A. They all get less through the milling process. So by the time you get to the salmon, you've got a far inferior product than the initial fish. You also need many more kilograms of the wild fish to make the farmed fish. So when the industry says that they need to farm salmon to feed people, it's an absolute fallacy. And if we could kind of cut out that step and have people eating the bait fish, which are all amazing fish to eat, then maybe that would be part of the solution. But again, like Caroline says, it's more random than having a regular-sized fish turn up on your slab, I suppose.
Yeah. So dealing with that randomness and being able to kind of improvise with what's available. But I think, and as a consumer, having that knowledge of how do we eat lower down the food chain, herring.
It also just promoting shellfish, I think.
Sorry, say that again, Elsa.
Sorry, like promoting farmed shellfish as a really good alternative. Yeah. It's full of goodness, amazing food. Nothing goes into the sea apart from the structure the shellfish are grown on. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
I think, so I was just going to say, I think a lot of it is about education, and obviously, so we have this campaign at Wild Fish called Off the Table, which is calling on chefs and restaurants to stop serving farmed salmon on account of all the different issues that we see with salmon. And it's a coalition campaign supported by lots of other interest groups as well, so it spans all the different issues. But I think the thing that we have really seen over the last few years is, there is a huge void of knowledge and awareness that people have around the issues with salmon. And I think just in the same way that the Norwegian salmon industry created demand for sushi in Japan, and that was something that they did a huge marketing push, the challenge now is really to have a similar kind of awareness push, but towards a more sustainable version of how we approach food and what our food system looks like.
And more diverse. Okay, I'm just looking at conscious of time, and I'm sure there are many, many questions. Yeah, hands already going up. So let's take some questions from the audience. We are being live streamed, so we're going to take some questions from online as well. Let's take 3 questions first from this room, and then we do 3 questions online. Okay, I saw yourself with the pole and egg, and then at the front here, and then at the back.
Hello, my name's Dale. I'm a seaweed processor from the southwest, and I also used to work on very big crabbing boats out of Dartmouth, and I now work on a crabbing boat which fishes 4 pots of string. and it's within the Lyme Bay Marine Protected Area, so there's no trawling allowed. And yeah, it's my livelihood for now. I'd just like to say a few things to try and, well, ask a few questions, but also stimulate some discussion. Because salmon is the most popular fish on the menu that is farmed in the world except for tilapia. It's obviously very important for here because it's the fish that we farm here. It's an intensive monoculture, absolutely, and what we are experiencing today or able to witness is that, and it's an industry which is about 40 years old. It's very, very young, and if you look at where we've come from in terms of intensively farming cows, I've had a great experience here, by the way. I've learned a lot about how to holistically manage a farm, but there is a grand potential to... I'm not a massive farm advocate. I'm a fisherman. I don't really like farm stuff, but there's a massive potential to improve salmon farming through, and these are my kind of ideas, stocking limits, obviously. The issues are stocking limits, feed, that's going into the salmon, health of the fish through, biological controls like lump suckers and wrasse. I'm not so sure about the wrasse because of the fact that they're taken from the wild, but there's something called an integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, and just to break that down, integrated meaning it's all farmed together, multi-trophic meaning it's from several levels, and so the idea of an IMTA in a salmon farm would be having mussels and oysters, and if you wanted to eat a sea cucumber on the seabed.
Sorry, can I just ask?
Yeah, all right, cool. Yeah. So basically, if these farms are well managed, is employment a massive metric for it? Because I see massive organic farms which, could be split into 50 or 10 smaller organic farms and employ more people. So is employment the best metric for success of an organic salmon farm? And that's kind of it, really. I just wanted to highlight the fact that, salmon farming's got a lot of issues, but I think that we're just seeing it at a very nascent stage. And I want to know your...
Well, I'd say it was the end of an era rather than nascent. I think it's just really run its course. And whilst small-scale locks were managed by small independent families maybe initially, we've so moved on from that. I think that ship sailed.
I think multi-trophic aquaculture systems, yes, definitely. Yeah. I think the inclusion of a carnivorous species within that is still problematic. But also I think what we see at the moment is the scale of the industry. And as you say about the densities, that was something I was going to mention, is in theory, if you had much, much lower densities within the farms, you could address a lot of the issues that we see with salmon farms. But that's not the economic model that's being used. It also wouldn't address all the issues, but it would address some.
Change as well. So one massive issue is basically the genetic change from farm salmon to wild salmon, right, and the escape, and then the fact that those are integrated into wild populations. But could you not, could you not employ more people through integrating other farming practices like mussels and oysters and scallops into a salmon farm, and thereby increase the diversity of the workforce and increase employment?
Maybe Elsie.
No. There's no
someone else.
Sorry, there's so much awful stuff coming off a fish farm. We've talked about the chemicals, the poo, the microplastics. I would never eat a shellfish that had come from the same farm as a salmon. Yeah, but you don't need to... And the industry are automating and jobs are being lost all the time. Locally, we had the last independent fish farm, which was called Wester Ross Fisheries, and that's been bought by Maui in the last 3 years. And they immediately shut down the local factory. They're now looking to replace hand feeding with feed barges. They have no interest in, they're not doing it to employ people. They're also centralising their feed systems now so that one person can govern all the feeding over a number of farms. They don't even need one person per farm anymore.
Still efficiency. There was a hand at the front, but it's gone down. So let's take your hand, and then there was one at the back. And in the green, we'll come back to you. We'll come back to you after we do online.
First of all, thanks to all the panelists. You have done a fantastic job and over the years, and I admire you for that. I haven't eaten salmon for, 12 years, and I know how difficult it is to try and persuade other people not to do the same thing. But it is a huge industry. It's 17 billion global, and it's one of Scotland's biggest exports. So there's no chance, really, of persuading, for me, governments to do anything much about it. And corporations have a lot of power, particularly the supermarkets. The person to my left knows all about the power of supermarkets in driving their agenda. So for me, the secret is to harness the power of the consumer, and I think that possibly that comes through educating people that it isn't wild salmon they're eating or organic salmon. Actually, it's treated in a chemical soup, and that must have an impact on the salmon, and therefore it must have an impact on their health. So my question is there data on that? Is there something that we can use to further the debate and get people to realise that this isn't a healthy food?
So I suppose, the health data, I think that's a gap that's not really been done in terms of what are the kind of health benefits of farm salmon, or the realities of the nutritional content of farm salmon. We do completely align with that in terms of the consumer being like the core focus, because actually at Wildfish, I think as an organisation, we spent 20 years advocating to the Scottish Government to better regulate, better legislate this industry. And a few years ago, we did shift our focus as well to the consumer, which is why we set up this campaign I mentioned called Off the Table, which is actually supported by Guy's partner also. The Bull in Totnes is one of our supporting restaurants, but it's using the power of chefs and the cultural kind of position that they hold, I suppose, to try and do that education piece. It is difficult. It's a really difficult conversation to have because people do like salmon. I think we just have to believe that the more there's such a myriad of issues associated with this particular fish that there will be something that resonates with people and something that makes them think, actually, maybe this isn't the best thing that I should be eating. But it's also creating, the hope is it's creating a space where we can use the knowledge and the expertise of people who work within hospitality to think, actually, what could the alternative be? And what else was saying, marketing, I mean, we can't do this as a fish conservation charity, but creating a space so that people can come forward and push that as an alternative and make it more of a positive message as well, because it is really difficult. There's so much negative messaging around campaigning, and obviously like the message that we bring as a charity is very negative at times, but this campaign really tries to actually create a vision for what we could move towards if consumers are kind of behind it, I suppose.
Through Slow Food, actually, I've seen an Italian professor do a very good comparison between farmed and wild salmon, so I can share that with Gina and she could share it, at some point if that's of interest. I'm not so sure that just because it's healthy, people will switch to it, though. Look how much we consume on the ultra-processed food. So, yeah, I do believe it's our industry in the sense it's the processing and the retail and the wholesales that have got to get their act together. And we sell it because it's reliable, cheap, and we can put a nice margin on it. And that's the problem that we've got to solve, I think.
One thing that I wanted to add was, you're talking about kind of health risks, and while the research is, as Rachel said, there's a bit of a gap, but last year the Consumer Food Standards Agency in Norway had flagged concern around an incident where production fish, so those fish that had died as a result of parasites and disease, had actually gone on to be sold to consumers. And, we're seeing cover-ups around this, and there are growing questions around is this fish suitable for human consumption? And I think it was someone from the industry had said in Norway, the diseased fish don't pose a risk to human health because we're not impacted by that. But of course, if you're a consumer and you know that you're consuming diseased fish. Like, I definitely wouldn't want to be consuming diseased fish. So, you know, I think there's a lot more going on than is in the consumer spotlight.
Giving us the 5 minutes.
Yeah, sorry, we should go to some questions online.
So there's a few questions online. First one from Joy Skipper. I'm a part of a group who present green screens at the local Picture House Cinema. Can you remind me the name of the film that started the presentation, but also if the panel could recommend any other films that would be useful to spread this discussion?
Yeah, the name of the film was Dying Locks. It's still not available online, but it will be shortly. While, I don't know, for suggesting other films, I would suggest many. The Patagonia Jamaica did work with other short films about different locations. Salmon Nation. There is Artificial, is also a documentary that I would suggest. I cannot avoid. I can't help to suggest to see Until the End of the World. It was the previous film.
That was a brilliant film.
It was the documentary about fish farming, sustainability in general, and I don't know what else.
There is also actually on our Off the Table campaign website, we have a video library, okay. So it might be worth having a look there as well for some other short films.
I believe someone is putting links and resources in the chat as well. So that resource library will be up. And there is another film coming out called Stop Salmon Farming for Good, which is a collaboration between Wildfish and Corin Smith, who was originally supposed to be part of the panel. So that should also be worth watching.
Another question from online. This is from Rod Everett. What forms of fish do you see as fully sustainable?
Hey.
It's all about catch method. It's not just about species. And I think this is the problem. At the moment, I'm working on a means of, for want of a better word, certification, but that's a loaded word. Everything looks at species at the moment. So if you look at Marine Stewardship Council, it says, don't eat cod, eat mackerel. It's much more loaded than that. It's much more subtle. It's where you are for a start, but it's also how the fish was caught. So in the best case scenario, you would try and get the catch method and who caught your fish. Was it an industrial fly shooter or was it a small inshore low impact vessel? In terms of your environmental and your social impact, that's much more important than which species are you eating.
May I add something?
Yeah.
But just to say that I think also that there is, probably the best choices for consumption is related to where you are living and also to your access to local production and fresh production, and etc. But of course, you have also to think about the amount, the general amount, because all of this is based on overconsumption, and so you also have to consider to reduce your consumption. Now we are around globally 20 kilo of fish yearly per capita. The consumption is about that. It's going to increase, and we have been telling before the projections are to go to 25 kilos. But when we go to watch the data for our Western countries, the figures are even higher, and we have to deal with that also, I think.
It's such a good point, because I think the British government recommends that we eat 2 portions of fish a day. If Britain didn't export 80% of the fish that it catches, and we're a small island nation, right? We should have plenty of fish. Even if we didn't export any of it, we would still only have just over 1 portion per person per week. That's of all the species that we land. Well, I think we've got to end.
We've got 1 minute left. I'm so sorry. Can we take one more, or are we very straight? Okay, hand at the back, because it's been up a few times.
Yeah, hi guys. This is a presentation that's extremely close to my heart. I spent 10 years of my life as a fishing guide, traveling the Northern Hemisphere. Also been down the Southern Hemisphere fishing for trout and guiding all over the world. Then I came home to be a regenerative, organic, pasture for life certified cattle farmer in the Tweed Valley. So my life revolves around wild salmon and cattle. In 2014, I was in Blenheim, New Zealand, listening to a presentation being hosted by New Zealand King Salmon, where Professor Kenneth Black of the Association of Scottish Marine Sciences was trying to influence Blenheim and the North Marlborough people over the benefits of salmon farming and essentially trying to justify it in terms of its low environmental impact, I pretty much humiliated the guy. So anyway, it was because he basically lied about the impacts. And to New Zealand, it's really, really important because of the strength of the rural communities and their involvement in the sea. Second thing, 2023, I met with top-tier SEPA on the farm because of our role in organic agriculture, to be informed that the Scottish Government instructed SEPA to have absolutely no involvement in salmon farming whatsoever. It is out of their jurisdiction. It has been left up to the policing by Marine Sciences. So SEPA have no involvement in salmon farming. You may not know that. I was told that. Now that's from SEPA themselves. It would be interesting to know what your views are on that. So my questions are, firstly...
Just one question. We're already at 10:30.
Firstly, what do you... The inconsistencies in salmon farming, if it was terrestrial farming, you'd see people doing time because of the mortality rates and the pollution. If it was terrestrial, it would collapse overnight. So what is the role? Do you believe there is a role of corruption within the salmon farming industry that is preventing change? Because the Scottish Government needs to justify independence, or at least that's what their narrative was. They don't want to lose £100 million worth of contribution to the economy. So there's that. Second of all, what do you see the role of terrestrial salmon farming, bringing it on land as a closed-loop industry? The waste from salmon farming is such a powerful resource.
Okay, so the question is, what do you see closed containment as a solution?
Yeah, on land, but also corruption. That's a really important thing for me.
Okay, anyone want to answer?
I can take the first part about SEPA and the corruption. I mean, I think there's definitely, and Elsa will back this up as well, there's definitely a history within Scotland of ignoring the science, but also there is a real... the culture of reporting on the industry in Scotland is all self-reported. So the industry has a huge role in, it basically marks its own homework a lot of the time, because it has a huge role in submitting the data that is then published as fact, and it's not verified. So I think there are definitely issues in that area.
Yeah.
Can I just say, SEPA do, unless it's changed recently, they definitely do seabed sampling around salmon farms.
Yeah, they do have a role in. I mean, yeah, they are active in regulating salmon farms. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
I think everybody is starting to move now, so we are being forced to wrap up.
Happy to talk more.
Follow anything up.